Good afternoon and welcome to today's Adweek webinar, where we'll be talking about how to scale your campaigns without sacrificing creativity. I'm Danielle Moore and I'll be your Adweek host today. Before we begin, I do want to take a minute to make sure everyone knows what to expect from today's event and is familiar with our platform here. Today's presentation should go somewhere in the 45-minute range, after which we will have time for audience Q&A. So if at any point you have a question for one of our speakers here, just use that Q&A tool right beneath the video window on your screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Also, definitely not too late to invite your colleagues to join us here at today's webinar. About 15 minutes ago, you should have received a final reminder email from us, and in there you can find a link to the webinar registration page that you can share with your colleagues. Still plenty of time for them to join us live, but do know that if they can't, today's webinar is being recorded and they can always catch that on-demand version. In fact, that recording is going to be available to all registrants today, so feel free to keep an eye out for that email. We'll send that recording out later around 3:30 Eastern when it's live. And if you would like a PDF of today's slide deck, as well as some other resources that the team at Smartsheet, our sponsor today, has provided, feel free to check out that event resources area right beneath the video window on your screen as well. As always, if you enjoyed today's webinar, be sure to check out the full Adweek webinars calendar at adweek.com/webinars, also linked below. Now, let me introduce you to today's speakers. We're very glad to be joined by Jenna Beaver, Senior Manager of Business Operations at Comcast. Jenna manages vendor partnerships and internal tools for Comcast's Xfinity marketing team. Welcome, Jenna. We're also pleased to welcome Stephen Macatino, VP of Marketing at the Global Demand Center at Cvent. Stephen leads a diverse global marketing team at Cvent, combining technical expertise, creative vision, and strategic thinking to extend the company's reach. Welcome. We're also pleased to welcome Kim Anderson, Fractional VP at Harper Wilde. Kim is a brand consultant and marketing leader with nearly 15 years in brand strategy, integrated marketing, content production, campaign development, and building talented creative teams. And finally, we're pleased to welcome Laura Murdoch, Manager, Marketing Project Management at Smartsheet. Laura is a seasoned marketing project manager professional with 14 years of combined marketing and SaaS experience spanning the private sector and government. All right, we've got a lot of great content to dive into today. So without further ado, let me bring our speakers up on screen here to get us started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. All right, over to you all to get us started.
Thanks, Danielle. So before we dive in, I'm really excited to introduce Smartsheet. Smartsheet, the enterprise work management platform, empowers organizations to innovate and achieve results faster, securely, and at scale through effective collaboration and streamlined workflows. By uniting people, content, and work, Smartsheet provides powerful capabilities that revolutionize the way teams operate. Smartsheet makes outcomes reliable, keeps your data safe, and ensures everyone is on the same page, making it ideal for organizations seeking efficient, impactful, collaborative work management. We're excited today to talk about scaling creativity at scale and help you learn how to empower your creative teams to scale on a budget. Let's dive in. I'm going to hand it over to Kim to tell us more about the topic.
Hey, everyone. I am so excited to kick off this discussion today because for marketing and creative leaders, it's a universal topic. Whether you're at an early stage startup like myself, a large Fortune 500 company, learning how to preserve creativity in whatever type of campaign you're building with your teams, it's not only a critical skill, it's an inevitability, especially in a challenging economic environment like today. For nearly a year, we've all read the headlines, listened to the podcast. If you're like me, you probably aimlessly scrolled the TikToks about these economic headwinds. Experts and armchair experts have been divided. Have we avoided a recession altogether? Is it just delayed? Regardless of the lack of alignment between these experts, there are warning signs that are sometimes flashing and bright that the economy is likely or might slump. And our friend, the Federal Reserve, has warned us more than once that rate hikes will slow economic growth. And as creative leaders, I know you're feeling the pressure of this. We all are. You probably wouldn't be this webinar if you weren't, so we're happy to have you. But it is a reality that influences our budgets, our planning, and a lot of times, unfortunately, our teams. One recent Ad Age article also noted that marketing more than other departments is coming under increased scrutiny because of inflation. And I don't think any of these numbers on screen are going to be very surprising to some of you, but 70% of CMOs say they don't even have the budget to deliver on the strategies that they've developed. And 75 have been asked to do more with less. If I could see all of you, I'm sure I can say, raise your hands, who's been asked to do exactly that? Probably all of us at some point or another. And I don't want to trigger anyone with one of the most polarizing words that creatives hate to hear, but who hasn't been told to just be scrappier? So what does this really mean for us as marketers and creatives today? We have the same expectations. Despite budget cuts, expectations really are the same, both from ourselves as shepherds of brands that have super high standards of creative and campaigns, but also from our leadership. We all want to make really bold, amazing creative work and campaigns. And we want to make sure that those get out there, that they get seen, that we can scale. But we're being asked to find ways to do a little bit more with a little bit less. So how do we do it? How can we prove our value as marketers, as creatives or leaders of creative teams? And how can we be just as creative in how we approach our campaigns, whether it's from a budget standpoint, an insight standpoint, and spend more than anything as we are in the creative itself? So at first, this balancing act of creativity and scale kind of feels at odds to some people. If you ask any creative, and I'm sure I could ask each of you, you'll probably say it's very challenging or almost impossible to create something creative when you're asked to do it at lightning speed or in massive quantities or with fewer resources. But those aren't, the only questions that I'm sure all of us are asking ourselves. The fundamental of, hey, can you deliver true creative campaign within a process-heavy organization? What role does process or guardrails have in the process in general? Can it help? Can it hinder? These are some of the questions that hopefully we'll get into discussion today in our roundtable, as well as Q&A at the end. But really, we want to talk through and kind of poke around to see, can boundaries help? Can they help our creative and our campaigns not only be the most creative they can be, but also allow them to flourish? Some of the most recognizable brands today that have huge teams and super complex hierarchy are doing this every day. Brands like Nike, Spotify, Virgin Atlantic, they are scaling campaigns that are incredibly creative. Now, you might not have the same budget as them, so that's something we want to get into for sure. But all the speakers on today's call, myself included, are really excited to get into this concept of, again, how do you scale without sacrificing that creativity? So without any more ado, I'm going to pass it over to Danielle, who will be leading our roundtable discussion.
Awesome. Thanks for teeing that up, Kim. As someone who's worked both very directly on the creative side as a creative and in growth marketing, I am so excited to pick all of your brains today. So let's dive in, shall we? So our first question here, do you think that formalized processes hurt or help creative work? Any thoughts there?
I'm definitely pro process. I think the word process gets a bad rap. When it comes to creative, people hear process and think restriction, but really that should not be the goal. And when you do it right, process can work hand in hand with creative. It can help to cut down on the administrative side of creating something, making us more organized and more efficient, to free up time to actually ideate, which I think is always the goal when it comes to doing creative work. Processes can also really help with collaboration across teams. So obviously, creatives are not working in a bubble when it comes to advertising. We're working across multiple teams. So really setting out clear processes helps with that. But the most important part, I think, is always going to be developing a process that works for creatives. So as someone who does that on a daily basis, you really have to tap into those stakeholders to figure out what is the right process for them, and making sure that all POVs are considered.
So
I agree. Sorry, I just jumped in, but I think the removal of admin is so important, so we can have more of that time truly for creative work. But these processes, these tools that hopefully a lot of us are starting to put in place so we can scale, I do think that it's not just about having these processes. It's about fueling an environment, a team that understands them. So hopefully, to Jenna's point, input in creating those, and then really fostering the use of them, because process for process sake, I have seen, kind of hinder. But if people understand it, if they see the value in it being a partner to creative and a partner to stronger creative, I think is where process can be the most impactful. I've definitely been at places before leading teams where it almost seems that there was this idea that you couldn't have process because it would ruin the creative, and this idea that like chaos was creativity. And it was almost like a very old school way of thinking of like, this is what a creative looks like. This is how a creative acts. Like they need Post-its on the wall. And if they don't have that, it's not a creative campaign. And I think while that is nice in theory, the idea of having some structure and rigor, including in the briefing process, so we know where to start, will make teams not just create like beautiful marketing campaigns, but beautiful marketing campaigns that have strategic intention and can be more effective. So I'm also very pro process, as long as the environment and the teams really understand it, know how to use it to break free the creative versus hinder it.
Such a great point, and such great examples from two different companies. Comcast is huge. Jenna, I worked with your cohort at NBC Universal. I know the importance of process there. And, Kim, your experience with Harper Wilde, understanding the importance of process in both of those contexts as a help and not a hindrance. I do want to dig a little bit deeper into that notion of, process and how you're using it, and get some more concrete examples with our next question here. So curious, how do your organizations leverage tools, processes, and standardization or templatization, things like that, to scale?
So I'll agree also too with my colleagues here that the processes do help, right? So I think they're important for us. We found that giving folks time and space, especially creative folks, to think collaboratively, I think as Jenna mentioned, it's pretty critical, right? So, but to a point, right? So we got to find the right balance of, are we initiating a process sake, right? Or can we get people involved and invested in that process so that they can think more creatively, but then also balancing the things to scale. So on our side at Cvent, we used to have a very templatized process around different program types that we built. It was a sequential kind of waterfall request process, right? And then we were finding, even though that we were getting folks to communicate, let's say, kind of effectively with each other, they really weren't being collaborative, right? So you could accept that work maybe at a different time zone than your other colleagues. I mean, you don't really have the context for that. And so then on our side, that was limiting some of the creative thought. Some of the things that we're doing now, we've initiated an agile marketing approach, and I think that that's helpful. I think, again, Jenna mentioned the concept of getting alignment early on. It's so critical. People feeling more invested in the outcome of the things that, let's say, we're producing as a function. And then also, maybe providing new perspectives or new opportunities. We also see a lot of value in having a retrospective, right? So looking back and figuring out, even if those are afterthoughts, it's fine, because it'll help inform things in the future, right? It could be a new way of doing things that could help with either scale and efficiency, or just a new creative idea that came as we're kind of looking things in the rearview mirror. We do balance self-service tools also. So sometimes we'll give teams that are maybe less traditionally creative, right, or designers, or maybe less technical, the ability to do customization. So an example might be our graphical templates. So we can give some creative freedom to the marketers that are working on that, while still sticking to brand guidelines, consistent styles. So we'll get the benefit of using templates for scale and brand standards, but also we do encourage feedback on things like the base templates, so that those things can be modified for the future.
Yeah, just to jump in here, I think both the previous question and what we're talking about now, like the actual tools and processes, one thing that I don't know if anyone had brought up yet, but also having that good change management plan to help people transition and learn the new processes in a pain-free way. The education and the communication of, hey, we're going to start doing these types of processes, it's going to help. And having clarity around how to get there, I think, is also super important. I myself sit on the PMO team within our marketing org. The work involves a lot of stakeholder groups, as we've been talking about. And scale starts with listening, I think, to what your teams need, and then focusing on the work that is frequent and consistent for what you want to make repeatable. And of course, making sure you're focusing on the right priorities as a company. And for us, that comes to life through Smartsheet Control Center. We've partnered with our studio operations team to stand up a templatized process for how we manage internal work. And by templatized, I mean basically saving days of work, because once we have a project, Control Center tees up pre-filled sheets, reports, dashboards, and they're all connected to each other and they're ready to use within minutes. And we ourselves customized this as a blueprint, and it takes us all the way from request intake to project end and auto archiving. And it's great that we can actually customize it to what we need. So again, getting back to what we see our teams needing, and then honing in on that. And other ways we achieve scale, which I won't dive into just yet, are Smartsheet resource management and Brandfolder digital asset management. So a lot of really great tools.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for those very comprehensive answers walking us through. I think that gives our audience a great idea of how you really can translate process to scale if you're using the right approach. So I do want to dive a little bit deeper into something we touched on in the first question with our next question here, which is creative freedom, right? And as a creative, that's something that, myself and my colleagues think about. I'm sure the creatives on your team will appreciate this as well. But, how do you balance that need for structure and process and the importance of that we've been talking about with that desire for creative freedom within those teams? And second part of the question, obviously, creativity evolves with each year. That's something we really believe here at Adweek and are constantly diving into. But for you guys and your organizations, how has the idea of what it means to be creative changed over time?
I can jump in on this one. I think as a marketing PM, it's important to advocate for the things that help you scale, like good processes and standardization, while also respecting that the creative process and creative professionals that you work with, they must be given their own space and breathing room to come up with bold ideas and let them flourish. And I think, just on a personal level, I've found that to be just such an important part of what it means to develop partnerships and hear the people you're working with and be a really good team player to them. So in practice for me, it's down to not just listening to what your creative partners need, but actually doing things to help follow through on supporting them. For me, I try to run a little bit of interference on if a discovery and concepting call needs to happen. I really want to be sure I'm hearing the creatives that I work with when they really just want a few designers and strategists who aren't feeling a time crunch or stakeholder eyes hovering on a call. They want that breathing room. And it's not necessarily I have to understand at a deep level, but I just need to respect that space. And then I think the other thing to strike that balance is proactive communication about schedule and when milestones need to happen and the why behind things, so that everyone feels bought in to why you might need to move faster on a project. And the same goes for review cycles. The more peace of mind that you can give your creative team that those pieces are clearly sorted out early, and this is how round 1, round 2, round 3 is going to go, that puts less stress on them, and the more that they can focus on the meaningful creative work.
So well said. Anything to add to that, Kim?
Yeah, I was going to kind of jump in on the second part of the question, which is how has the idea of what it means to be creative changed over time? And I think it's also connected to the first one in terms of what structure or process do you need to put in place to balance that creative freedom? I think there is a general evolving nature. I've seen it in my work, both in-house at brands as well as a consultant, of there are higher expectations on creative being really, really strategic. I think there are a lot of signs within the creative and marketing space, such as the CMO role, really being short-lived and a revolving door, you have to prove you're creative very quickly. And I think the days of just really funny, amazing, beautiful creative and campaigns is gone. Unfortunately, in some ways, I do think that you have to not just produce things that are gorgeous for gorgeous sake, however we want to interpret the word gorgeous there, but they need to be effective. They need to, yes, drive sales and brand love and connect with customers, but you have to prove out, like, either as the person leading these teams or as part of that team, that there is value in the work and it will drive something for the business. I think, kind of what I was talking about earlier with just all the pressure from an economic standpoint is creative has to be very purposeful and very effective. And I think that how that's kind of changed teams, at least in my experience, is everyone has to be more strategic. So back in like the agency world, old school model, like sometimes there was an expectation that creatives needed to be strategic. That was the strategist or the planner role and the brief, and they would put the insights down or the channel feedback that should inform a creative idea, hand it off to creative. Creative would kind of go off in a silo, create something beautiful and come back. And I think that entire process has broken down in a really positive way where everyone has to be creative and everyone has to be strategic. So when I'm building campaigns with other people and other partners, like I'm expecting my CFO is just as creative in what they're doing and how she's moving around budgets so we can create more. I'm expecting my on-set producer to be scrappy, I'll say it again, and really smart and strategic with like, how can we build something really effectively with more talent on a day? I think it's just the entire idea of there's not only one role who's strategic. There's not only one role who's creative, and everyone has to embrace different sides of that no matter what the role. So the end result is much stronger. So I think that's just an evolution in terms of where creative happens. I think it's way less of a one part of the process, and it's the foundation, the DNA of the entire process.
On our side, sometimes too, we talk about creative solutioning for like even the technical teams, right? And then to your point earlier on limited budgets, we have to get pretty creative now, right, to accomplish the same goals sometimes with this restriction on resources that we're all facing. So I think it's interesting to think about the term creative or creativity, different applications outside of maybe what we might, historically view as like more of a design element, right?
Absolutely. So well put. And I love your point too, Kim, about how sometimes process breakdown can be a good thing in terms of, helping encourage folks throughout the org to be both creative and strategic. So great examples there. So if there's one thing that I think we could take away from this discussion so far is that it's the creativity and scale have to coexist, right? We need both in the current landscape and to evolve and to stay ahead. So I want to know, to wrap up this discussion from each of you, what's one thing that you think your team can implement in the future to help with maintaining that balance between creativity and scalability? Jenna, I'll throw that to you first.
Sure. Yeah. I think we do a lot of versioning. There's a lot of different offers in different areas, and it's often something that's kind of rinse and repeat. We're using the same, opening creative and then adding an offer at the end. And I think a big opportunity for us is really to use some of the content automation tools out there to help create those kind of rinse and repeat items. And it takes away from some of the time, a creative is spending redoing the same piece over and over again and lets them come up with new ideas. We use Brandfolder for our digital asset management, and there's a tool within Brandfolder where you can upload the approved creative that the team has worked on, and then it allows non-creatives to go in and edit something to really help with scaling.
Yeah, great point. I can certainly speak from experience that those types of features and capabilities are enormously helpful and save a lot of time in creative requests. Stephen, I'm going to throw this one to you next.
So we ask our teams to focus, we're asking them to focus even more, right, on goals prior to projects and programs getting started, and then ultimately business outcomes, right? So we're kind of saying focus less on the activities that you were running before, right? So it's okay for us to do less in times like these, right? With budgets and kind of resources going down, right? So sometimes scale gets accomplished by doing things or creating many things for a lot of audiences, but we kind of have to balance this concept of reach with depth, the depth of engagement, and then ultimately the effectiveness. So that's kind of the thing that we're pushing internally here, and hopefully, again, folks can be a little bit more creative about the decisions that we're making and the types of things that we're going to do in order to drive those business outcomes.
Absolutely. Yeah. It doesn't always mean doing more, right? It can mean doing certain things more deeply and better. Kim, your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think if I were to take one thing away that I tell my teams is, and some of this goes back to this idea of how is like the creative process changed over time, in my opinion. I think just the concept of flexibility and balancing from a creative team standpoint, a marketing team standpoint, I think historically creative has been very protected, which is great because we have really high standards. I'm sure all of us do in terms of what's out there in the world and making sure it is consistent and clear and reflective of, a brand's product vision and values. But I do think in this new world, some flexibility allows for stronger scale. So a lot of us talked about these templates and tools. And it's not about taking that power away from creative and being like the full owner of assets and creative and work that goes out there, but just flexibility in terms of loosening the reins a little bit so that we can be more effective as a unit. So I think, again, kind of the idea of breaking down the process in a good way. And I think flexibility as well in terms of changing technology and looking at it as a partner and companion to creating stronger creative and getting your teams to really focus on like the good creative work versus things like versioning or cutting one video multiple times, which isn't maybe the best use of like our hardcore team's time anymore. So being flexible, I would say, in allowing standards to still be high, but maybe go beyond what we used to do in terms of where things happen, who things happen with, what tools, and then also looking at other and new tools as they come out, not as in fear, but as in a companion to your creative work.
Very well said. Thank you for that. Laura, what's your take here?
Yeah, I think definitely within our organization, just to talk a little bit more about like brand folder, love that, Jenna, you called that out. That's definitely, brand folder by Smartsheet is a huge way we scale. To talk a little bit about like the embedding CDN links on web pages. That's one feature I really love with that. If you have an update to an image, you're just pulling in CDN links and all you have to do is update a new version in brand folder and you don't have to worry about manually updating other places on the website. It just auto-populates. That's a great way to scale your operations. And I think we've all talked a little bit about trying to make things a little more self-serve when it comes to templatizing images and resizing existing assets and getting to that point, that flexibility where your organization and your studio puts out that brand guidance with templatizable, self-serving things that other teams can use, and not put that burden on the creative team. Brand folder is another way that we do that because of how well it templatizes things. Beyond that, I could talk all day, honestly, about the automations that we use within Smartsheet. So I'll kind of stay limited there. But I really enjoy finding ways to just constantly put automations on my sheets. Creative approvals is one way that you can sort of engineer your own, depending on your use case, how you want to seek out creative approvals and make that a really streamlined process. And I think, future is the key word with this question. And just more broadly, I think as a marketing PM these days, you have to pay attention to what's happening with generative AI and there's still a ton to learn from it, but it's exciting to think about how that can be used to scale our work even further, whether you're the PM or a creative professional. For me, it can look like things like asking questions of an AI tool to say, give me a full work breakdown structure or a work back if I want to hit these milestones on these dates. I think we're a long way off from getting the sort of output that you can just slap on a project plan. You still need to take a really scrutinizing eye to those things, but just finding those ways in the future that we kind of stay ahead of the curve that way too, I think is going to be super important.
Super appreciate you putting that all into perspective for us. Thank you all so much for your thoughtful response to this question and to the full roundtable discussion. We're going to go ahead and transition into our audience Q&A section here. As I mentioned earlier, we do have time to take a few audience questions. We're going to get to as many as we can over the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. So please feel free, if you haven't yet, go ahead and put a question into the Q&A box right beneath the video window on your screen. Just know that if we don't get to your question today, we're always going to make sure they get forwarded over to our speakers so they have the opportunity to reply offline. First, a couple of quick reminders here just from the Adweek side. Today's webinar has been recorded, and we will email you a link to that on-demand recording later today, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. And if you'd like a copy of today's slides, as well as access to the article and ebook that Smartsheet has provided us with today, you can go ahead and grab those from the event resources area, also right beneath the video window on your screen. Now, let's get to some of these questions. The first question here that I want to just jump right in with, Kim, you mentioned this term multiple times throughout our event today. I feel like I have a love-hate relationship with it. Would love for you to unpack it for us. What does scrappier mean to you?
Great question. So maybe I assume too many people would know what that word means. And this is probably reflective of my time as playing a kind of multiple team approach as a creative, but also on the brain and marketing side. So I would say there's probably multiple definitions of scrappy. It's definitely a word that among the creative community, it is usually in context of creating work in a cheaper way, a faster way, in mass quantities and with less resources. And I would say those resources might be time, actual tools, budget, and team. So there's this idea of get scrappy. And so to do things really leanly, I actually think that doing things scrappily is what births the really social video, and how now expectations on video content and campaigns, you don't need to have huge budgets and huge cameras and huge teams to create really effective work. We've seen that time and time again with things like the influencer and creative marketplace and just how much that shifted over the past 10 years. But we've also seen it in terms of performance. Like for us at Harper Wilde, our content and our campaigns that feature our actual customers, real women, and usually on grainy iPhone style shots, campaigns perform better than some of our slick ones. That's not true for every brand. So it's an interesting word. Usually though, it means to do things quickly and cheaply. And so sometimes that does not yield the most creative work, but sometimes I think it does force teams to think about, hey, we are in today's world, and if we want to get something done and we really want to make sure our work is out there, where can we cut things while still trying to, again, preserve the intention of the concept or the campaign, but not break the bank. So yeah, scrappy is usually a call to do things quicker, faster, cheaper.
Great point. Thank you for unpacking that for us, Kim. And that leads us really well into our next question. So you mentioned social video. I think that falls very well into the categories we're asking about here. But someone asks, what tactics and channels are the most impactful when you're trying to balance budget and creativity? Do any stand out as having better or ROI across your teams? And also any that should be avoided when you're considering either of those factors? Any thoughts there from anyone?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this. I love this question. I think for me, in my experience, there are so many different tactics and channels. And, whether it's earned media or organic social, paid media, display, web, you have so many options out there, and it can be pretty overwhelming. But I think it really gets back to what's the stated goal that you're trying to achieve for your campaign, and breaking that down further into like, what is your number one KPI? And it doesn't mean that you always have to hit it. But what are you going to learn at the end of the day? But really, until you as a team all align on what your goal is that you're trying to achieve, it can be a different mix of tactics that is the right formula to get you to achieve your goals. And taking that one step further, I think that's it's just a great opportunity to emphasize that, from what I've seen, the importance of, when it comes back to process, not skipping or sort of skimming past those early stage conversations about what our really our stated goal is going to be for what we're setting out to achieve. And then at the end of your project, how are we going to measure? Well, really doing planning before the end of the project to line up how you're going to data collect, how you're going to analyze things, and then coming back together at the end to really assess what your output was and your ROI, and then from there iterate. So yeah, really love this question. It's not an easy answer, but it really ties back to goals, I think.
Absolutely. Great point. A lot of that's going to be determined on what your goals are and how you define them. And to your point, having those conversations early on, so everyone's on the same page there. Very much appreciate that.
I have some thoughts on this one. Maybe not surprisingly, big believer in the event tactic and channels, right? So events of all kinds, right? Virtual, like this event is great. We do a lot of in-person stuff, from road shows to conferences and all of that. And from a budget perspective, even though it's, let's say, not the cheapest, right? There's a lot of things that go into venue rentals and logistics and all that, even travel. We find that there's a lot of ROI when we look at it from an attribution point of view. But I think the biggest thing for us as a marketing function is it does drive creativity, right? You're forced to think about creative ways to engage with your audience, and even just like the aesthetics of an event, right? You got to think about new ways of doing that so it does pop and you're drawing attention to the right areas. From a content perspective, we're able to repurpose a lot of that. So that's also beneficial for us when we think about the investment. But then the other critical thing is you're getting that feedback often in real time. So if you're doing something creative or you're trying something new, and let's say it's not panning out, or you're doing it and it's working out great and it's phenomenal, it does, I think, also give some reinforcement back to the folks that are, bold enough to come up with those ideas that, hey, something worked great, or I need to go back to the drawing board. And you get that, like, literally, obviously, face to face in some cases, which is, I think, really good for our kind of marketing development.
Yeah, excellent points there. So our next question here, depending on what line of business folks in the audience are in, or what kind of clients they serve, some may have to deal with compliance regulations that can be pretty strict. So curious about any recommendations you may have for that. Specifically, what are your recommendations for dealing with stringent compliance regulations when developing creative work? And also, do you see any role that generative AI can play for scaling creative within those kind of processes? Any thoughts there?
I can definitely jump in on the compliance side of things. So before Harper Wilde, which if you aren't super familiar, it's a female-founded bra and underwear company. So we deal with a lot of compliance in terms of trying to showcase our products because there are pretty outdated rules, a lot of across marketing as well as social platforms that are also quite misogynistic in terms of what we can show women in product versus men in product. And then formerly, I was at Can Social Tonics, which is a cannabis brand. And so very, very intense regulations and compliance when it comes to creativity. For both, I always lived by this kind of mentality of compliance creativity. I think it does force you to really understand what story you're going to tell if you do have again, regulation and rules on marketing. So things might not be as product marketing focused. You might not be able to go through all your RTBs and really hit at those core product benefits. And you might have to focus more on the storytelling. So the more brand marketing as opposed to performance marketing. We definitely, in both companies, we definitely it sounds so basic, but reading the rules and really knowing the regulations, you'd be surprised at the loopholes that you can find. And so even at Harper Wilde, we have in LA, but we have a full list of like every single rule. And some of them might be like as basic as you have to show a belly button in every single photo. If you don't have a belly button for some reason, no one knows why. So we might literally put one in the ad that you can't really see, not even on the person. And I know that sounds so silly, but there are loopholes that you can creatively get around. It's also making sure that the regulations aren't just something that's like in a brief, but that truly the creative team knows them and kind of knows them in and out, because that will force creativity when we know, again, what those guidelines or rules are. And then I would say also work with your legal team to understand what your company's risk factor is. I remember when I first got into the cannabis game, there's all these hard rules, but realistically, it's all about what risk you're willing to take. And more often than not, I was surprised by the willingness to take a risk, because at the end of the day, a lot of these platforms and ad regs are using AI to scan to see if you're not meeting any of those compliance regulations. Sometimes they get skipped, but a lot of times it's literally an individual who you can work with. So I think, again, a little basic, but talk to your leader team, understand what your risk is, work with your founders, or if you are, like, outline it so you have a clear point of view of where those guardrails are. And I found that actually allowed us to push boundaries more often than not. And specifically within the cannabis world, that was some of like the richest creative and campaigns that I've ever created with the strictest regulations. So I think you can see it. And I'm not sure what industry this question came from. But I think that there are loopholes, and it pushes you again to understand, or to really try to think creatively, and how can I still storytell and market about a product that I might not be able to really communicate what it is, what it does, effects, etc.
So well said. Thank you for that, Kim. And you have just sort of like the most perfect examples. Curious, you said you had some really rich creative that you worked on, and part of it was so rich because, you're working around these regulations. Do you have a favorite campaign or moment that came out of having to work within those confines?
Yeah, it's a pretty iconic one. If you haven't seen it, for this was when I was at Can Social Tonics, a microdose cannabis beverage. In summer of 2022, it's a queer founded brand. The two founders are amazing. They are both queer, and we did a great Pride campaign. But because cannabis, you can't do any broadcast commercials. You will not be on TV. That is something we know. And it's very hard to show your product in use. Because we're a beverage, there are rules. You couldn't show anyone consuming it. Like physically, you can show liquid, but not in a hands. There's these really weird, intense rules. You can't communicate effect. And you really can't create commercials. So instead, we made a music video and an original song. It was called Taste So Good. It ended up being, we used all queer talent, songwriters, production, everything behind the scenes and in front of the camera. We had Kesha, Vincent, a phenomenal songwriter who actually wrote the track. We had a queer director. And what we thought was just going to be like, okay, well, we can't create a commercial. We'll just do a little fun little music video. Ended up being our most successful campaign to date. It got picked up by by Spotify, by Amazon Pride during Pride Month for like all their Pride playlists. All of the talent involved, we started to consider talent as our publisher and as our broadcast, because we couldn't get it on regular channels or CTV or streaming. And it became a part of the zeitgeist, which was great. And that was because it really hit at kind of the lifestyle of microdose social tonic and replacing alcohol versus saying, hey, this is a microdose beverage with 2 milligrams of this and 4 milligrams of that. It was more narrative in nature. And also it was just kind of sneaky. So like the lyrics actually described the effect of the product without specifically saying it. So it's literally, it calls Taste So Good. And it basically communicated the flavor profile and the effects without using the words. So that was an extreme one, but really, really fun and forced us to be very creative.
Awesome example. Gina, do you have any examples to share from the Comcast side of things or points on compliance?
Yeah.
So before I was with Comcast, I worked in pharma media with Publicis Health Media, and obviously pharma has tons and tons of regulations too. And I think, kind of echoing what Kim was saying, it's important to have people who are really experts in the regulations and know what's going to get through and what's not going to get through. So before we go down a path, we're kind of holding up a yellow light, like let's maybe take a step back and look at this again. And now at the Comcast side, there's not as much legal or like regulatory, but we do have to go through legal for everything, as I think most companies probably do. And something we've found that's really helpful is having a reference back to what legal is approved in the past and what has been okay to use and what has not been okay to use. So kind of same thing as we did on the pharma side, we can go back and say, hey, like this worked really well and it was an effective in the ad at the end of the day. Can we play off of this? Or if, for some reason legal pushes back on something that we've used similarly before, we have that reference to say, you liked this before, are we okay to move forward? Like, this is why we changed it, and kind of using those references.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point about building on the history of approvals and really knowing your stuff there as well. So appreciate that. Our last question here, to wrap things up, I think this is a really good one to sort of sum up our conversation today. So someone says creativity is about solving problems with innovation, as you've all touched on throughout our discussions. How does creativity show up for each of you in your roles in your day-to-day work?
I'm happy to chat about this. I think it's really just thinking about creativity in areas where you don't traditionally think are creative. So my title is business operations. That doesn't sound like very creative, but really looking at things you've done the same way over and over again and thinking about a new way, that is creative. So really giving teams who maybe traditionally aren't part of the actual creative department the path to think about their work in a new and innovative way is really helpful for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Just shaking things up in that respect. Laura, anything to add from your perspective here?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jenna. I love that the Smartsheet platform for me gives me the ability to flex a little creativity in my work. It's exciting for me that I can be the person that is designing and building a solution to solve a problem for my team. For me, it usually starts with a pain point that I'm having and selfishly want to solve to make my life easier. And that's how I built a campaign launch report for a program we did about SponsorX. I don't think I have time to talk about that too much today, but check it out if you can. As the PM, the team is going to look to you to orchestrate all of these various activities, right? And if I was going to confidently pull that off, I quickly needed to come up with like one reliable place I could go with all of the planned events, the go live times, and what time zones, because we were coordinating with teams all across the globe. And just for my own sanity, like I needed that, right? But as I started building it, I started to see all the different ways that everyone else was benefiting from it. And people tell you, right? They give you feedback like, oh, thank you for creating this launch report. This is what we need. And then you can start to gather that feedback from everybody and iterate further, like how you can continue making it better, what you built originally for yourself. So I find a little creative freedom in that, and it's a great feeling.
Absolutely. Stephen, anything from your end here?
I think the favorite part of my job is when we got people in a room together, right? And so it's clarify maybe around a problem statement or an opportunity, and then it's that brainstorming and kind of creative solutioning together, which I think is pretty cool, right? So the collaborative aspect of it is where we drum up a lot of creativity because you get perspectives from all sorts of different folks.
Yeah, absolutely. Creativity as group project. I like that. Kim, anything from your perspective to share here?
Yeah, I would say very connected to what Stephen was saying, like collaboration, brainstorming. I feel the most creative in moments where I'm learning, and like the sense of just like leaving time for play, even at work, is really important, I think, to marketing and creative team, any team actually. So just like having time and venues for listening, for brainstorming, honestly, like reading some, again, basic stuff probably, but like newsletters, spending time on social, even when I don't want to, because I'm trying to get my social time down, just to see like what trends are happening, different ways to create content, what can I learn? And even things like just playing around. Right now, I'm in a very play around with AI, see how it can be a companion versus a competitor. So playing in Midjourney, playing in ChatGPT, even just using that for like starter of ideas has been really interesting, and feeding that to teams and seeing that they can come up with better ideas. But there's the kernel that we're getting, which is really great. So I would say, yeah, weaving time in for play, brainstorm, and collaboration always leads to my better work and my team's better work.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives there. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions today. I'd like to thank our speakers, Laura, Kim, Jenna, and Stephen, as well as our sponsor today, Smartsheet. Some final reminders here from Adweek. Make sure you download those slides from the event resources area, as well as the additional resources that Smartsheet has provided there, the Harnessing AI article, as well as that So Long Silos ebook. If you're looking for more info on this topic, definitely good to dig into those. If you enjoyed today's webinar, be sure to check out the Adweek webinars calendar to learn more about our upcoming events. Again, a huge thank you to our speakers for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you to our audience for joining us live. And as always, we look forward to seeing everyone at an upcoming Adweek webinar. Thank you all.